The Communists won the Chinese Civil War even though they were at a huge disadvantage with the Nationalists. Mao Zedong's convincing manner and actions led peasants and landlords to support him to lead victory against the Kuomintang officials and Jiang Jieshi, leader of the Nationalists. They were much less efficient and were extremely hostile toward their citizens, and soon the Nationalists lost support from their community. The Communists were effectively able to use the Nationalists' corruptness for their advantage and continuously won wars until they drove Jiang Jieshi to Taiwan.
Previously, before the Chinese Civil War even started, many factors were used to contribute to this bloody massacre. It had first started with Sun Zhongshan, who reorganized the Tongminhui, the Chinese Revolutionary Party, to the Kuomintang, also known as the GMD or Nationalists. He believed that the only way for China to move forward was to use Western ways of industry and agriculture. He brought about the Chinese Revolution because of his important role of overthrowing the Qing dynasty during the Xinhai Revolution, which ended China's last imperial dynasty, the Manchu, and led to the Republic of China. Under Sun Zhongshan's rule, where he had taken over, there were opposing forces and ideas. This constructed the communist side of the Chinese Civil War. When Jiang Jieshi ordered the purge of the communists, it began the First Chinese Civil War.
It didn't seem that Mao Zedong and the People's Liberation Army, also known as the PLA, would win. Before the time of disaster, when Jiang Jieshi didn't win a single war during 1945 to 1949, he had an incredible lead on the communists with a strong army and multiple supporting figures siding with him. He even drove Mao Zedong to the Jingguang Mountains. Many of the Kuomintang forces suppressed the Chinese Communist Party, causing Mao to have many failed uprisings, including the Autumn Harvest Uprising and Guangzhou. The Autumn Harvest Uprising was an insurrection that took place in Hunan and Jiangxi provinces on September 7, 1927. After initial success, the uprising was put down. America also sent massive amounts of ammunition and military supplies to the Kuomintang, and they were able to effectively utilize the artillery to attack and weaken the forces of the CCP. Many citizens from China all had thought that the nationalists would have won, but why did Mao Zedong end up victorious?
The communists' convincing actions directed towards farmers quickly gained support among them. The communists were skilled at using newspapers, radio, and films to spread communist propaganda. As Mao says in one of his speeches, apart from the proletariat who are the most thoroughgoing of the revolutionary Democrats, the peasants form by far the largest group. The overwhelming majority of the peasants, that is, except the rich peasants who have a feudal tail, actively demand land to the tiller. The urban petty bourgeoisie are also revolutionary Democrats, and land to the tiller will prove to be to their advantage as well, for it will help to develop the productive forces in agriculture. The point of land to the tiller is to transfer land and property to the peasants, separating them from the landlords and reforming the system. This benefited not only peasants but the urban and national middle class as they needed markets. This idea originates from Dr. Sun Yat-sen in a thesis he wrote. Mao tried to enforce this idea by pitting peasants against landlords through a land reform policy. Aware that the peasants would be very willing to identify landlord greed as the chief cause of their suffering, communists engaged in the ritual public humiliation of landlords. It was invariably a brutal business, with the peasants being urged to vent their fury and frustration on their exploiters. In these rituals, peasants were encouraged to take landlords' property, speak against their exploiters, and even kill them in some cases. These rituals were called speaking bitterness. The point was to strengthen peasant forces, an element in the land reform policy. These were organized by committees in communist-controlled areas. It was a tragedy. About 2 million people had been killed, and on average, about 1 in 5 people were labeled landlords. This went on until 1952.
Many of Jiang Jiechi's speeches to convince his citizens included situations where he presented his ideas of strict rules and the consequences put on if the rules were broken. These rules involved 4 virtues in order to have mortality: ritual, righteousness, integrity, and sense of shame. During this time, there were too many consumers and not enough producers. Jiechi believed that the virtues would solve many problems. The nationalists initially had the upper hand, but as they continued to lose more and more, Jiang did not want to share power with the communists and planned to slowly steal soldiers from the communists and bring them into their own army. Moreover, the nationalist army was plagued by corruption, low morale, and inefficiency. The nationalist government of China had been accused of mass killings with a death toll between 6 to 8.5 million, which came from communist advance, political repression, the confiscating of goods for nationalist officials, disease during conscription campaigns, and the man-made floods by the nationalists to stop Japanese advance. The Kuomintang government was filled with incompetent officials, including tax collectors, also called blood-sucking devils. Getting involved in the Chinese Civil War and World War II meant that he had to invest in resources to support war rather than to the needs of the people. Heavy taxes, government debt, inflation, unemployment, and food shortages caused many to lose faith in the nationalist government. Jiang Jieshi not only belittled his citizens, but also ignored the suffering of peasants. He helped landlords take back lands that the communists handed over to the peasants. The government also punished peasants for participating in Mao's land distribution programs. Even before, when Jiang Jieshi was a child, he was obsessed with the topic of war. He believed that everyone should have a military mind and should act in a similar way to robots, marching, respect, and no emotions. This made his thinking unpopular among people, and at the end of the war, many people died because of that fight. As for Mao Zedong's popularity, he himself was the son of a prosperous peasant, which caused him to support Chinese nationalism and had an anti-imperialist look, also influenced because of the Shanghai Revolution and the May 4th movement, where many protesters died from the army.
The Japanese, the USSR, and America participated in the Chinese Civil War. The sudden loss for Japan in the World War caused Jiang Jieshi to be unprepared in adapting to the new situation, while Mao Zedong used it to boost his forces. Jiang Jieshi planned for the Japanese to invade China and defeat the communists. However, because of their ally America, who defeated the Japanese and also stopped participating in the war after giving up trying to set peace talks for the two forces, Jiang Jieshi's plan ended in an abrupt halt. Jiang Jieshi depended much on America for artillery and ammunition. The U.S. forces flew tens of thousands of nationalist Chinese troops into Japanese-controlled territory and allowed them to accept the Japanese surrender. America had known that the war would only end up in disaster and tried to end it with the previous peace talks. However, the truce was tenuous, and in spite of repeated efforts by U.S. General George Marshall to broker an agreement, by 1946 the two sides were fighting an all-out civil war. Any measures to push forward, and with his poor control, some Japanese forces were even forced to join the communists. Japanese commanders in China chose to make formal surrenders to the nearest Chinese military authority, which happened to be the local communist commanders. As for Mao Zedong's ally, the USSR, they were vital towards the defeat of the nationalists. The USSR bombed and attacked many important factories, destroying millions of dollars of ammunition and supplies.
However, outside forces weren't the only forces that played a part in the victory of the communists. Inside forces, such as the People's Liberation Army, were trained well and were incredibly loyal to Mao Zedong, which opposed the Nationalist Army, as the nationalist soldiers were forced to fight in the war. The soldiers within the PLA helped reinforce and uphold Mao's word, carrying out Mao's commands and helping the people of China. Unlike the soldiers in Jiang Jieshi's army, the PLA soldiers believed in Mao's new image for China, remaining loyal to the communists. As Mao Zedong said, "This army is powerful because all its members have a conscious discipline. They have come together and they fight not for the private interests of a few individuals or a narrow clique, but for the interest of the broad masses and of the whole nation. The sole purpose of this army is to stand firm with the Chinese people and to serve them wholeheartedly." Mao's encouragement towards the PLA to serve the people and the nation inspired them to carry out orders that Mao issued. The soldiers were able to look up to him with the same interest of helping the people of China, as he would lead them to the new era for China, where peasants would no longer be looked down on or poor. All in all, the communists mainly won because of four important factors: Mao's convincing actions, which gained the farmers' support; Jiang Jieshi's leadership, which consisted of bad military decisions; outside forces such as the Japanese; and inside forces such as the People's Liberation Army. These factors each played an important role in the war over power between the nationalists and communists, and allowed the communists to prevail.